welcome our next speaker, Jonathan Hoffman, a senior consultant. Today he'll be presenting his session, Automate with Power, Workflows and the Functional Developer. Please stick around after Jonathan's session for a live Q&A.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Hoffman. I am a Dynamics 365 senior consultant for CE with Blue Horseshoe Solutions in Carmel, Indiana. I have been doing this for about 5 years. I started out as a functional super user, kind of system admin type role with Blue Horseshoe internally. We had a client for our AX practice that needed a consultant for CE. And so I kind of jumped ship from the internal side over to consulting. I've been doing that for about 3 years now, and it's been very, very exciting, but also very nerve-wracking. And so I wanted to do this presentation for everyone to kind of share some of the things that I've found that I wish I had known when I started out as a consultant, and so that I can kind of share some of that knowledge. My industry background as a consultant with Blue Horseshoe has been healthcare, telecommunications, and government sector implementation and support. So both delivering the product and then also following up after an implementation for long-term support. Prior to coming to Blue Horseshoe, I've spent 18 years in the military. I'm getting ready to retire as Human Resources Sergeant here in the next 2 years. And my wife and I own a bar in Lebanon, Indiana, called That Sports Bar. If you're ever in the area, we'd love to see you. Okay, so we're going to go into a session overview. Basically, I wanted to make sure that I covered the target audience. I know sometimes we go into these sessions and we're not really sure what we're getting ourselves into. I mean, the description sounds great, but maybe it's just not our cup of tea when we get done. So this session is for new users of Dynamics CE. You know, maybe you've been a system admin, you know, making some fields, making sure data is good. Maybe you've kind of just a regular user even, that you understand the processes within the organization and you think that you can kind of help improve those with some automation. We want to make sure that this session gives you the tools that you need, at least to get a basic understanding of workflows and how they operate. And also new consultants, people that are just breaking into the industry. Maybe you don't have any experience, you're straight out of college, or like me, you come from a project management background, never have done any kind of consulting work before. I feel like this is a good class for you to kind of learn how to leverage Dynamics CE. So what are we going to learn today? Well, basically, I'm going to give you a high-level summary of the different kinds of functional Power Platform automation methods. I'm going to talk about like a mid-level review of those features, some differences between the automation methods. Talk about when we should use a specific workflow type, and some practical application scenarios that I've personally handled during my journey. So there's two kinds of functional automation when it comes to Dynamics 365 CE. You've got workflows. These workflows can be real-time. They can fire off in the background, or they can be on demand. And they can be any combination of those three, except for both real-time and background. And then we've got PowerAutomate Flows. Those are only in the background, but you can also run them on demand as necessary. So when should I use a workflow to automate my system? A big piece of Dynamics CE's workflows that I loved is that I didn't need a developer to help me do my job. And helping clients learn how to use these workflows, I feel like really brings a lot of value to what we do as consultants. Developers are expensive. Consulting is expensive. And so if I can train a super user on how to create a workflow in the system to kind of leverage some of that logic, some of that automation, it just shows that we actually care about the client more than we care about making money. And So on the user side, they really appreciate, that learning. Another time to use a workflow is when you need to make quick updates to logic. Maybe there's not a developer around. Maybe you don't really need a major change. It's you need to change a date for a process from 2020 to 2021. A PowerAutomate workflow or a real-time workflow inside of CRM allows you to be able to get in there quick, make those changes. 15, 20 minutes, you're in and out, and you've got a new working process. And then also when you need to manually trigger some automation, we have a lot of plugins that do things for us automatically that say, okay, when this happens, do this. When this happens, do this. Well, both PowerAutomate and workflows inside of CE allow you to manually trigger them. So you don't have to worry about, okay, well, I don't really know when this needs to happen. I just know it needs to happen. The ability to manually trigger them, I think, goes a long way, especially when you have a lot of records that you might need to update. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to talk about the different types of workflows. So the first one I'm going to go over is real-time workflows. This is known as a synchronous workflow. Synchronous workflows or real-time workflows, they happen immediately. As soon as you trigger the workflow, the conditions are going to start getting reviewed and see, okay, what's going on here? And on your screen, you're going to see that the process running. So you don't have to worry about, is it working or is it not? And depending on the action, maybe you're updating records, maybe you're creating records, you can actually see it happening on your screen as it's running. The screen will automatically refresh for you, and whatever you needed to happen will be there in front of you. Now, there are some pros and cons to real-time workflows. So pros for both real-time and background workflows and on-demand, they're really easy to configure. I had about 2 weeks of experience in CE before I started writing my own workflows. Now, some of the more advanced stuff, it took me a while to learn that, but I was able to send emails. I was able to prevent other processes from triggering based on the steps inside of this process. And so it was really good for me to kind of dig in, starting with workflows inside of CE. One of the other pros is that you can do it before or after an event happens, whether it's an update of a record, maybe it is on create or on delete of a specific record. You can have different things trigger based on those. They don't require a refresh, which is really amazing. When you've got a user that's not sure what's going on in the system, or maybe something on your screen needs to get changed before you can move to step B, not having a user wait 30 seconds and refresh their screen, to me, goes a long way as far as a user experience goes. You can use them to require fields before taking an action. And what I mean by that is I consider them pseudo business rules. The concept of a business rule inside of CE is that, based on one of these conditions, fields may appear or hide. They can be required, not required. Well, if you require a field, you can't even save your record and get off the screen before it says, oh, nope, you have to have data. Well, what if you don't have that data? That's when a workflow goes a long way for making sure that, you have that data. You can also turn on error messages to show why a workflow failed. So, as part of that prevent save, based on a required field during a process, you can display an error message like, okay, why can't a user move past this particular point? With a real-time workflow, it runs through, and if it hits a failure condition, it pops up a big glaring error message that you get to customize, saying, oh, you have to have data in this particular field before you can qualify this lead, or before you can close this opportunity and move it to finance and operations. One of the other pros is that it executes all steps as one transaction. So it can be kind of a double-edged sword, but for the most part, it's really great knowing that you're not going to get halfway through a process that's success, and then maybe a bunch of different things fired off, but then you hit a failure. Everything's going to roll back and basically give you a redo. You don't have to worry about it sending an email when it wasn't ready to be sent. Now, our cons, it only logs errors if error logging is on. It's not going to show you whether or not the workflow is successful. It's not going to really give you any good data as far as why the workflow failed without the error logging on. Sure, you can go into your system processes and take a look and see why, what step something failed on, but it's kind of hard to see. Turning on those cancel workflow if this condition was wrong, it gives you a clear visibility into what you're trying to do. Now, as I mentioned, the double-edged sword, failures can be hard to troubleshoot because the whole operation rolls back. If you have a workflow that has 3 or 4 child workflows associated with it, maybe nested within each other, and you're trying to figure out which one of those workflows caused a problem, it can be a little bit of a headache when you're going through. But for the most part, if you've got a skilled troubleshooter on your team and you've got some experience digging in there, you can sort it out pretty well. The last con for real-time workflows, in my opinion, is that users have to stop working while the workflow runs. You can't just get in there, fire off something, and keep on moving. You're stuck watching the workflow running, and depending on how deep that workflow goes, how big of a process it is, how many records it's updating, it could take 10, 20, 30 seconds to fire off. So when you're dealing with real-time workflows, you want to make sure you're only using them in scenarios that you absolutely need them. Okay, background workflows. They're set up the exact same way as a real-time workflow, but these run in the background. They're happening behind the scenes while you continue to work. And these workflows for backgrounds are being replaced by PowerAutomate. Microsoft recommends that as of the most recent rollout, that you start all of your workflows or all of your background flows with PowerAutomate. Identify if what you're trying to do can be done using a PowerAutomate flow. And if it can't, okay, now go inside of the CE interface and do what you need to do. One consideration for both PowerAutomate and for CE workflows is that you do have certain API limits that have to be met. And that's a topic that is, it's been around for a while, but it's just recently starting to be enforced. But those API limits are basically every single time you update, you pull a record, you delete, you create. In the background, the system is processing these transactions, and you're only allowed a certain number of them per day. So by leveraging the PowerAutomate or leveraging the CE background workflows, you can see each of those steps as they're being done and kind of get a good idea for how much of your resources that you're consuming. Okay, pros and cons of background workflows. Pros, again, really easy to configure. Users can keep going while they're being executed. One really nice thing about them is that child workflows process independently, meaning if you have even a real-time workflow and you have a child workflow that is in the background, it's going to trigger that child background workflow to go run, and it's going to process independently of anything else that's going on because it gets added to a different queue. And so that can be good or bad, but for the most part, if you need to be able to send an email, let's say to a user, after a specific field is updated in real time. You don't have to sit and wait for that email to be sent or whatever task to be created. You can just keep on working and know that, okay, eventually the system's going to send this out. And logging all background processes is really amazing. You can see when it was successful, when it failed, and then, if it failed, why it failed. But seeing how many times a particular process is running per day also gives you a good idea of your API limitations as well. If you have a transaction that's being done once a month versus a transaction that's being done 10 times a day, maybe it's not something that really needs to be automated anymore. Maybe it's something that, we can manually make an update in the system to keep from clogging up your queue for other things. Cons, user has to update their screen in order to see that data that you pushed. If you created a record, if you reassigned, if you updated data, a control F5 is necessary once the job's done. And you don't know when it's going to actually run. I personally always tell my clients that it could take up to 15 minutes to fire. Generally, it doesn't take that long, but the system does have a queue, and the queues go in order. You could have, in a large workflow, 10 or 20 things that are happening, and they all have to happen in order. They're not happening at the same time. So, it's kind of wait your turn in line, and when we get to it, we'll get to it. So a user could sit there and refresh 5, 6, 7 times, hoping that data is going to be there, and it might not be yet. Another con is that it's only run after an event. You can't do something before a record is created. You have to wait until after it's created to trigger it. Multiple triggers can cause multiple consecutive runs of this. And by that, I mean that if you trigger a background workflow, it's going to go into that queue. And let's say you have a record update that triggers the same one again. Maybe it's a status field. When it changes, do something. Well, if you have both of those in the queue at the same time, it's not going to look at the data that was present at the time of the first one being added. It's going to look at the data that's present at the time that it actually ran. So a good example is that one of my clients had a on-change workflow that said whenever a field changed from new to submitted, send an email to a specific team letting them know that there is an action waiting for them. Well, they then changed it because they were the approver of this. They then changed it to approved as well. It sent 2 different workflow triggers into the system. And so 2 emails went out saying that it was ready for approval, that it was approved, because that first one that said, hey, this has been submitted, never went. So if you had, let's say, a VP or something that needed to keep eyes on, or I guess it would be like an ops manager that needed to keep eyes on who was submitting, when it was being submitted, things like that, they might not get that email because we're so quick processing through these. So that's definitely a consideration to have, is how quickly your data is being updated after interacting with it. And then the last con, this is kind of a best practice that I've learned through my 5 years with Blue Horseshoe, learning from other consultants, other industry experts. Don't use wait conditions inside of Dynamics CE because it sits inside of your queue and it hogs up your system resources. It's constantly checking, okay, is this ready? Is this ready? Is this ready? And if it's constantly checking, it's slowing down your other processes from running. So just as an industry best practice, if you have something that needs a wait condition, try to find a way around that, maybe creating a task now with a due date of next year instead of waiting 9 months to create the task with a 3-month deadline. or SSRS reports, creating reports outside of CE, and then maybe having that report push data into CE to trigger a workflow as soon as it's pushed in. Though those are two methods that we recommend to kind of get rid of those resource consumption issues. On-demand workflows. These are kind of my favorite ones to use because they're very, very dynamic. You can do them in real time or in the background. You trigger them via user interaction. Now, I know that kind of gets away from the whole point of automation, but at the same time, if you've got a record that you need to update, an email that you need to send, it's easy to go into the ellipsis, click a button, fire it off on, any number of records inside of CE. And then also you can use a view or inside of Advanced Find to run workflows that need to go out. Now you can't run a flow inside of Advanced Find, but you can create a view and run it from the different dashboard views. Pros and cons of on-demand. Again, real easy to configure. They're the exact same thing as the other two. It's just an option that you select on the screen saying, hey, I want to be able to run this whenever I want. Okay, they can also be triggered systematically. So as I mentioned, it's just a toggle to allow you to choose whether or not you want to run it via the system, by itself, or both. The cons, unfortunately, being able to trigger at any time can be a bad thing. You've got a user that's a little click happy. Maybe he didn't he or she didn't use some QA resources to make sure that their data was good, and now they just sent out an RFP to a customer that had grossly overestimated items, you maybe sent an update to your ops manager that said, hey, we just closed this sale, but you're not actually ready to close the sale for another week because you accidentally entered the wrong data in. Having a manual trigger can also mean that a user can forget to trigger an action. If it's not set up systematically and they're forced to go do something, they might not. You have to have some really good SOPs and some really good documented processes to kind of encourage them to hit that button. And the other bad thing is that depending on how many items you have inside of your ribbon, which is the little bar above your views and above your records, if you're inside of a record, depending on how many items is there, you might not find the flow or the run workflow buttons. You might have to hit the little ellipsis, and it's sometimes buried in there. So here's the new and improved, the PowerAutomate flows that everybody's talking about now. So PowerAutomate, again, always processes in the background. It's got a separate UI from workflows in CE. You're going to have to go to a different page to create these flows. They can be triggered systematically or on demand. And some of our pros is that, you can do a lot of things with PowerAutomate that you can't do inside of CE without using a lot of custom code. One of my favorite things to do is update child records using PowerAutomate. It's way easier than having somebody write a plugin for you or a custom workflow action and then having to get all the developer to add that in there. You can do all that yourself using PowerAutomate now. It's got a really clean interface. The logic is really easy to follow. You've got a branching tree structure starting at the top and then it comes down, yes or no based on different conditions. It's got a built-in error checker, which is really nice. If you accidentally typed in the wrong database name or you selected a value that doesn't actually exist inside the system, it'll tell you that it's wrong. And then it has some really great testing and error logging too. When every single time the flow runs, it's going to tell you how long it took, whether it was successful or it failed. And then you can click into it and see, okay, yep, now I know I didn't put the correct condition here and I didn't put an exit clause for what should happen if it fails. So I really do like that functionality. The cons, it's harder to configure than CE workflows. I am not great with PowerAutomate Flows yet. I'm getting there. But there's still a lot of things that I would much rather do inside of CE because it's 2 button clicks versus having to select, every single step of the way. Now, some might think that that's a good thing, that they have total control over that flow. I'm more of a keep it simple, stupid type person. Don't let me do anything that I could accidentally break something. Many of the actions inside of PowerAutomate, they do require some kind of knowledge of coding, database structure, or XML. Now, with the XML, you can usually get that. That's going to be used for like filtering, setting up your conditions on what data should be pulled or what data should be transferred. If this, then that type stuff. And I am a completely functional user with some JavaScript experience. So sometimes I bang my head against the wall trying to figure out how to get these to run and then go Google and figure out how somebody else did it so that I don't have to reinvent the wheel. Another con is background only. And the last one that I think is kind of a downside to PowerAutomate is that you have to create 2 separate flows for an on-demand and a systematic process. Now, functionally, they can do the exact same thing, but the triggers are going to be different. On one trigger, it's going to be on select of a record. On a different trigger, it's going to be, okay, when data on this record gets updated. So, I mean, when it comes to ease of use, I definitely give dynamic CE workflows the upper hand there. But when it comes to functionality, there's just no beating PowerAutomate right now unless you've got a really good developer. The last thing too is that importing and exporting your flows can be a little bit of a pain. There's some good connector tools now. A connector is basically what databases you hit, whether you're logging into your CDS, your Common Data Service, or the Dataverse, or if you're connecting to a Power App, or you're connecting to a SharePoint, things like that. A connector is any of those logins or those references to those logins. Currently, if you create a flow by itself and then export it to another environment to be consumed, like say dev to test, test to prod, it doesn't bring those connectors with it. You have to reconnect all of them. Now there is using Power Apps in the solution editor. If you create a flow inside of a Power App solution editor, it does bring those connector references. You reset it up one time with the production environment, and then every single time you promote that, it maintains that reference to where it's going to be going. So, that's been something that I struggled with for several months before I finally figured out how to use those. It's made my life easier, but no one told me that they existed. I accidentally stumbled upon it, and so that can be kind of frustrating for users. So some practical application scenarios, the one I talked about earlier, prevent save. This was a big lifesaver for a healthcare client that I worked with. Basically, they needed to capture as much data as possible for a client, and they needed to be able to save their records. But before they processed this particular application or this particular insurance claim, there had to be specific fields that had data in them. Now, the initial thought was, okay, well, we'll just mark this as business required. But then they realized they couldn't advance past that screen. Fields 1 through 5 had data, but fields 6 and 7 didn't. And that was a huge pain in the neck for them. So what we were able to do is we were able to leverage the prevent save functionality, which is what we like to call it, of a real-time workflow. And your workflow trigger is going to be before an update occurs. So before the status changes, before you create a record, before you update a specific field, we're going to check and see, do those fields contain data? If no, we're going to add an exit workflow clause that says cancel the workflow. inside of that cancel workflow error message, inside of that exit workflow error inside of that exit workflow condition, it's going to say, okay, well, is it stop successful or stop canceled? No matter which option you choose, it's going to give you a choice to add a message that displays on the screen. Now, if it's successful, I don't want to bug somebody with a prompt saying, okay, congratulations. They're just going to know it worked. But if it's not successful because of whatever reason, any number of those fields that you can identify and outline inside of that workflow, you can say, okay, well, this field doesn't have data, that field doesn't have data. You can nest your and ors inside of a workflow step to say, okay, well, if these two fields don't contain data, display this error message. But if these other two fields don't contain data, display this error message. It had I want to say that it added a lot of value to their team, even though the users didn't understand why it was erroring out on them all the time at first. Once we got them some good training, it made their QA process for submissions much, much easier. Email notifications, this is another one. So a client needs to send an email to notify a user that a record is created, or they need to reassign a record to someone else. Workflow type, this is where we're going to use those background workflows. PowerAutomate, start with that, or use a background workflow in CE. Again, I'm not going to lie, as much as Microsoft totes PowerAutomate, I am old school and I love being able to create my workflow inside of CE. And so that's what I personally prefer. But again, Microsoft suggests PowerAutomate. Workflow start trigger, that's going to be after an update occurs. And your conditions are kind of as needed. Do you have specific fields that you're going to trigger on? Do you have a specific user that it's going to go to? Maybe a team or a queue, things like that. You can pull in all kinds of data using the dynamic workflow options when you're setting your properties of the workflow. As far as your considerations there, when you're assigning a record to a user, it's very, very important to know that the user has to have a PowerPlatform license in order to be assigned a record to them. Internally at my company, we have a support team that has a lot of people. Not all of them are using CRM, but we still needed to be able to assign records to them so that we could manage, who it was assigned to. And we didn't want to create contacts in the system for every single person. So what we did is we enabled PowerApps licensing and made sure that they cannot edit any records. And we assigned that PowerApps license to them, a view-only security role, and then that let them be able to be assigned records without managing them in CE, which is against the terms and conditions of the license. Last practical application scenario I've got is being able to update child records. This one was huge for me in CE. Being able to see this done in PowerPlatform was amazing. So a client needs to make sure that the contacts are updated with a specific field value from an account if the account data changes. So this was super important for another one of my healthcare clients where if a hospital network that someone belonged to changed, then all of the contacts under that needed to make sure that their affiliation changed as well. The reason this is important is because of the portal. Without having the ability to set up custom code on the portal, that was kind of a no-no for us. We were like, hey, we don't want to write code that may not be supported in the next rollout. We leveraged the relationship between a contact in a hospital and an account in the hospital. So what we did is we used PowerAutomate, and we said after the record gets updated, we're going to identify the parent record, get a list of all related records that meet a condition, and apply that data to each of those records that we just identified using the list. But wait, there's more. So there's some really, really amazing free tools out there that are available for functional consultants, super users, and administrators. I can't toot the horn loudly enough for these two because they've been great for me as someone that knows how to do zero coding inside of the CRM. XRM Toolbox is one that a lot of people will hear. There's so many different things that this can do. I can't even go into all of them, but this is the biggest tool that I've ever used for CRM to help me do my job. The thing that I really like about it in this context is that it allows users to execute bulk workflow updates. So you create a view. Let's say there's 7,000 records inside of that view. Well, you can only do them 250 at a time inside of CRM, but you can click a button and have them all run inside of XRM Toolbox and do that bulk workflow update. I personally updated in one run 1.8 million records for one of my healthcare clients because we needed to roll over Medicare data from one year to the next. We didn't want to have to go into each of those and push new data in. This did it. I want to say it took somewhere around 36 hours, but it was running in the background the whole time. I didn't have to have anybody go in and touch this stuff. And it saved the client a lot of money and a lot of man hours. So you can find that at xrmtoolbox.com, completely free. They take some donations if you really like the product. And then the second one is the Dynamics 365 workflow tools. It's on GitHub, which is a free code repository. And basically, this is going to give you some custom workflow actions that normally require code. The tools that get added are things like calculate dates, calculate differences between dates, add dynamic values to dates, things like that, that you can't do inside of CRM without custom code. And so it is very, very appreciated that that this tool was put out there for us to just install into any CRM environment and just be able to go with it. All right, so in summary, what did we learn today? Well, we got a high-level summary of the different kinds of functional CE PowerPlatform automation methods. We got a medium-level review of the features and differences between the automation methods. We kind of talked about when we should use a specific workflow type, and we talked about some of the practical application scenarios that I've personally handled. So this is the end of my presentation. I really appreciate all of you joining me today. Don't forget that we do have a live Q&A after this. And I appreciate any of you that use the chat functionality to ask me questions. Thank you for voting me in for Dynamics Con for 2021. And I look forward to working with you in the future.
Hey, I'm Jonathan's buddy for this, so I will be asking him your questions and a couple that I wrote myself, if time allows. Jonathan, I'll just start off and then jump into these. If you want to tell us how you ended up in the consulting role for CRM CE.
Yeah, so I started with Blue Horseshoe in January of 2016, working in the project management office. Basically, I was grading all of my PMs and directors for kind of quality assurance and things like that. And I did that for just about 2 years, while also filling a dual hat role as a CRM admin, sysadmin for internal. I have some Salesforce experience before this, which is how I ended up with Blue Horseshoe. So after a while, we ended up with a AX 2012 client that needed some CRM work. And to that point, I was the only person in the company that knew CRM. So I was not a consultant, but they kind of threw me to the wolves a little bit and said, hey, you know how to do this, you take care of them. And then, kind of hit the ground running from there. I got a lot of good OJT, on-the-job training, with my first client, and I ended up working with them for almost 3 full years I was their developer for 3 years. And it gave me a lot of my experience that I had as we started to build up Blue Horseshoe's CRM team. Yourself and Jeff becoming mentors for me in that space. And then just recently, I was promoted to senior consultant. And so now I've transitioned from a developer, a functional type role into a lead type role, getting to mentor some of our junior consultants myself, doing some more PMing on my side, and kind of a hybrid BA role, even, doing lots of requirements gathering on both the client side as well as providing those requirements to our technical developers.
So the one question looks like it's already answered. Is there a way on a real-time workflow to have it show up in the flow button for certain people? And someone did say the ribbon workbench, which I think is an awesome tool. Just throwing that out there. Another one, how can you select multiple items and run a PowerAutomate flow on all of them?
So what I've done inside of the UI is that when you create a view in CRM or CE, if you call it, you can use that view to use those PowerAutomate flows inside of the system. So let's say you've got a specific field you want to trigger off of, maybe a condition on that field, like it has to be this value, it has to be that value. You have the ability to select that view, and maybe it's all records. You want to update all of them within that view. You select whichever records you need to update, and then up in the ribbon or the command bar, or whichever version we're calling that, you'll see the flow button that you can click, and then you get to choose which flows you run against your selected records. And then, of course, it runs in the background and knocks all that work out for you.
There was one from Joseph, but I believe Chad got him an answer in the chat. So I'll pass that one. And then Allison asked for the GitHub link. I threw that in the chat while we were going.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's see. That's that one. That's something different. What's the most amount of workflows you've ever seen chained together? Obviously a poor practice.
Well, so that's actually something that I don't remember if I mentioned it inside my session. It's something I should have. That was kind of a con to it was a con to classic workflows, and that's you can only nest a workflow 4 deep within a single workflow. So meaning you can have a condition and then another condition nested, and so on, 4 deep. After that, it's no longer supported and you won't be able to execute your workflow. So that very first healthcare client that I got to work with had 17 nested workflows within one another. So workflow 1 would call 2, would call 3, would call 4, all of them being child workflows. And it was a real mess, but that was the only way that we were able to really do what they needed to do with all the different conditions without writing custom code. So It did the job. It's not something that I would personally recommend doing ever again, but we made it happen for them with no code.
Another one. What's the most, this is probably not the right word, exciting thing you've done in CRM or CE?
So for me, I think the most exciting thing that I've done was that. I came in mid-project and was helping out another consultant from another company, and we kind of had to tackle it together to make sure that it was being maintained. It certainly was not fun documenting that process by any means, but seeing all of those workflows just chain off and just create this pool, or when you see those workflows hitting inside the queue and you're like, oh yeah, this is all working great, like that gave me a lot of satisfaction. What about you, Mike?
I was just thinking how bad my memory is. I guess lately we've been doing a portal for field service and marketing built in, and that's just kind of a new challenge. I like to try to throw something together on there, but you'd have to give me a couple hours to remember something. You do have another one. What tools do you use to document your workflows?
Yeah, so the one that I use primarily within Blue Horseshoe is going to be Visio. I would capture all of my requirements in both Excel as well as Visio, doing business process flows and work streams. And then using the different tabs and off-page references and things like that in Visio, I was able to link. It ended up being 215 or 220, something like that, tabs inside of Visio to document the full process.
Oh, the one on my other screen watching the chat, it's behind, so I'm just watching you mouth nothing, thinking that that's the live one. Jonathan, that is all the questions I've seen, unless anyone else throws one in at the last second. So I'll talk slightly slower than I normally do. But other than that, if there's anything you care to share, maybe you came up with after you did this.
No, I think that the reason that I did this class, as I mentioned before, is there's not a lot of focus on functional developers and understanding of functional work with inside CE. Like everybody's like, oh, well, there's a system admin and then there's developers. But I was speaking with Chad, who presented yesterday, and on pretty much the same topic. So nice work, Chad. That was pretty awesome. We were talking how functional development isn't really a thing. You hear about developers and they're considered the guys and gals that write the code. And even though we don't write code, we're still doing development within Dynamics CE, even if it's using a drag and drop interface or point and click interface. So that's why I wanted to do this session, is to kind of really call out the power that we have as functional users to make some of these things happen that you might not be able to expect to happen.
We did get another one from the mistaken identity friend of mine from earlier during my course. Have you done any integrations from CE to NAV 2017 specifically?
I personally have not. I know that internally at Blue Horseshoe, since I've been here, we've done some things with Dynamics AX as far as like old versions of CRM hooking in. I think CRM 2016, CRM OL. being able to manually create those integrations and use the old integration tools. I know we've done F&O a few times, and some different integrations with HubSpot and with click dimensions and things like that. I would say I have to check and see if any of the other senior people on our team have done those integrations, because I personally have not.
So somebody has. That's Business Central now for anybody who's never heard it called Nav or Navision.
I did not know that, so thank you for that.
Yeah, when I started, it was Nav. I don't know what year, but I don't know. I have a bad memory. That's all the questions. So, Jonathan, unless you have anything else, I think we're good to wrap up.
Yeah, no. I'll
wait. Oh. What's the name of the XRM tool you're talking about? Oh, sorry, Jonathan Blackham.
Yeah,
my bad.
I'm actually interested in that too, because that would make my life so much easier. Then I could just build it and have it document it for me, and I wouldn't have to document it ahead of time. So I don't have anything else for today. I appreciate everyone's time. I'll give you back, 8 minutes so you can go and do other things before your next session. Flow Visio Builder, for anyone that is interested, is what it's called inside of XRM Toolbox. So again, thank you everyone. That wraps up today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a good day tomorrow too.